This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. At our Military History Night of October the 16th, retired RCAF Brigadier Paul Hayes talked to us about his experiences in the 1950s training the newly reconstituted German Luftwaffe on the Canadian version of the F-86 Sabrejet. Achtung, Sabrejetz.
Well, thank you very much, Pat. I'm usually not used in giving this presentation. I've done it about 25 times now to various groups across Canada. And I usually like to wander around and talk to the slides, but they want to record this, so I'll stand here most of the time. I can change the slides from here. That's just the introductory slide. I'll talk about that picture a little later. That's one of the first Sabres delivered to the German Air Force by Canada. And 422 Squadron was where in Baden, Zolingen was where I spent my first 3.5 years. We all had individual call signs. The squadron call sign was Tomahawk, as you might imagine. I was Tomahawk 28. So if you called the tower and said it's Tomahawk 28, they knew exactly who made that mistake. So I'll go on from here and see if this thing works. There we are. This is a report okay. There we go. This is an article I wrote for the Vintage Wings in Ottawa, or in Gatineau, that has the famous heritage flight, including a Mark 6 Sabre, which I will talk about a little later. That's me talking to one of the German pilots while I was assigned to the Germans, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. It's got a couple of interesting features to it. Well, just a little bit on my background. I was recruited as a reserve or RCAF auxiliary technician, and my sergeant said to me one day, would I like to learn to fly? The reserve sponsors pilots to go away. So I took after I finished my high school, this is 1952-53, that's me climbing into a Harvard at Claresholm, Alberta, first trip ever in an airplane, dual number 1 on the Harvard, with an instructor who'd been a World War II Spitfire pilot. And I'm 19 years old, or 18 years old at that point. So not much has changed since then. My pride overwhelms me at times. This is what we started out on, in which I spent the first 11 months of my flying career flying these in various modes to learn to fly. The venerable yellow Peril, or the Harvard as we called it. A great airplane, and you learn very quickly. On our course of 60 Canadian students, we graduated 40 after 11 months of training. The rest failed, the other 20. This is where we were in Alberta. The star is Claresholm, Alberta, just south of Calgary. But one of the very interesting things was the British Commonwealth Air Training Plant, which trained hundreds and thousands of pilots and navigators and radio officers during the war. These were all, the little circles were British Commonwealth Air Training Plant sites during the war. Claresholm was reactivated in 1952 to accommodate the buildup of the Canadian Air Force, particularly with the Cold War and for NATO service. So that's a good thing. There was also a base in Calgary as well, at Currie Barracks, another airport. This is what Claresholm looked like during the war, the traditional triangle. Not much there at that time. I got this from the library in Claresholm, of all things. I phoned them, and the girl said, oh yeah, we've got all kinds of historical stuff, and she sent me these pictures. That's what it looked like when I was there. We had about 150 Harvards on the base, Harvard aircraft on the base, 3 courses of 60 students just going full bore all the time. Something I forgot to mention out on the previous map showing the various sites, we also operated out of Lethbridge and Fort Macleod, which had air bases from the war, because we just didn't have enough capacity at Claresholm to handle all that air traffic. Intense pressure to get the training done for the NATO commitment that Canada had taken on in Europe and other places. We did everything in the Harvard. There was no holds barred. Aerobatics, formation flying, bombing and gunnery, which we did during that 11-month period till I finished my training. And so the pressure was on, very intense flying going on all the time. Great instructors. Most of them were World War II veterans who'd come back into the Air Force when we started rebuilding, so it was really terrific. In fact, my flight commander at Claresholm had been DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross winner, on fighters during the war. After the war, when the Air Force was demobilized, he went and flew for the Israelis in the Great War against the Egyptians and other people over there, the creation of Israel, really. He flew for them. And then he came back and joined the Canadian Air Force during the build-up, and he was my flight commander in, Art Fay was his name, in Claresholm. Air fighting practice, we did that as well. Radar intercepts against other Harvards so we could learn how to use the airplane or use an airplane in a supposed air combat scenario. So that was the route, that was what it was all about. What's left of Claresholm, of course, is nothing. I visited there once when I was out west in Calgary. I drove down to Claresholm and all it was, there's still a runway there for the town, but all the hangars are gone, they've fallen into the dirt. The only people living on the base was a guy living in what had been the officers' quarters, or the officers' mess, and he had a sheep farm out behind. Southern Alberta, cattle, right? Wild animals. But I like that. It was a great part of the country. Well, this is the Harvard. This is for people in the room who are in that mode, who fly airplanes, that it was a pretty high-performance airplane for its time to start out with, at square one, never having been in an airplane before. But our instructors were tremendous, and they were very helpful, and the level of training was very intense. But compared to some other airplanes I've flown since, that cockpit was very well organized, very well set up. It was really a well-designed piece of cake. Tradition still continues, of course. There's a group in Tillsonburg, Ontario, called the Canadian Harvard Aircraft Association that have 8 Harvards and a Yale and a Tiger Moth, I think, and they go around doing air demonstrations across the country. I'm a life member of that. I couldn't stop myself from joining. I haven't flown the Harvard with them yet. Well, I finished my flying training as a reserve-sponsored pilot. I ended up back in Toronto in August 1953. Went and enrolled in the University of Toronto to do my Bachelor of Arts, and within a week, I was flying these. No dual, no two-seaters. You read the book, you wrote the exam, somebody watched while you started it, and you went flying. And that was it. And the reserve at that time, 411 Squadron in Toronto, had been a Spitfire squadron during the war, and was now assigned as a reserve squadron in Toronto along with 400. And our job with these aircraft, the Vampire jet, was the air defense of Canada. You have to remember, at that time, so much of the regular force resources were going into manning the 12 squadrons in Europe, the 12 Sabre squadrons in Europe, and that's where so much of the resources were going, that the reserves, the auxiliary as it was called at the time, had the assignment of the air defense of Canada. And we ran regular exercises against ourselves, against the Americans just south of the border, and practice intercepts with radar. There's a heavy radar just north of Toronto up near Barrie at Edgar, and we were working with them constantly on this kind of thing. And as a young reserve pilot, university student, I was getting a fair bit of flying and a lot of incentive to, when you worked with 20 other guys who were World War II, all had flown fighters in combat. You sort of had a pretty steep learning curve, but you picked up a lot of lore from them and how to do the job and their commitment to the mission on behalf of Canada. We were quite young. Here I was flying the Vampire. I was 20 years old or 21 years old. In fact, when I initially started flying it, I couldn't drive a car. How the hell did I get from Lawrence and Avenue Road out to Downsview, which was out in the middle of nowhere? Well, it was hitchhike or somebody picked me up and drive me out. There was no buses, no nothing, but we did it and we got out there and worked. This is a picture on the left-hand side of myself and Ron Richardson. We were down in Trenton doing live firing training, real guns, shooting at targets. And that's me, that was a photo done for the Toronto Star for the CNE Air Show. So history comes in. One of the things that's interesting here, this is Marion Orr, who was a very famous women aviatrix during the World War II, and she was involved with the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, ferrying aircraft from the factories to the operational squadrons. And when I started at university, and here I was flying with the reserve, my friends were bugging me to take them flying. And I couldn't take them in a military aircraft, so we used to come in over Maple Airport on our way back into Downsview, and I saw this little airport, and so I went down to Transport Canada, and when they saw I was in the Air Force, they gave me a commercial license. I didn't have to write any exams or do any tests, as long as I had a current medical. I went up to Maple Airport, and here was the owner of Maple Airport, Marion Orr. And she checked me out in the Aeronca Champ and the Piper Cub, and I could then take my friends flying, and everybody was happy. And I still fly general aviation aircraft, GA aircraft. So she was a great lady, but she was killed in a car accident down in the States sometime after that. Well, moving the reserve ahead, we needed more advanced equipment if we were going to do the mission. They gave us T-33s to start, the twin trainer, but that was an advance in terms of aircraft performance and capability. And then, as they converted the squadrons in Europe to the more advanced Sabre, they brought some of the Mark V Sabres back, this one, and they gave them to the reserve squadrons. So that was the end of the Vampire, and now into the Sabre. That was about the time I graduated from university. And I went down and I thought, gee, I got a university degree. The regular Air Force might like that. I went down to recruiting, and they came back in a day and said, here's the offer. Continue with the Sabre. Upon successful completion of the operational training unit, you posted to 4 Fighter Wing Baden-Zolling in Germany. And you pay back your reserve time for your pension, and there was a whole bunch of other things. But boy, young guy with a university degree, single, full of gung-ho, I couldn't resist, so I joined the regular force. And I ended up over in Germany, 422 Squadron. You saw the Tomahawk on the first slide. This arm shall do it was the motto. That's 4 of our Mark VI Sabres, the most advanced version. Information, that was for our Christmas card. I'm flying in that one. And at the bottom is a lineup of our aircraft at Decci, Sardinia on the big weapons training exercise, and I'll talk about that a little later because that was a mandatory requirement every 6 months, 3 weeks in Sardinia, live firing for 3 weeks. Tune in the guns, tune in the gun sights, and it was a terrific thing. Kept us right at the peak of our operational capability. I always throw this slide in because the Sabre, with a swept wing and swept tail, was a great looking machine in formation. Really great. There's the Golden Hawks, famous aerobatic team. I still see the leader, Vern Villeneuve, the first leader. He's a good friend of mine. I'll be talking to him shortly. I had a chance just before after I'd come back to Canada, they asked me if I'd like to join the Hawks as one of the pilots, and I went on the trials with them, and they canned the team. Mr. Diefenbaker said for $1 million a year is too expensive. But that's the way the world turns, isn't it, when you get into politics? Well, map of West Germany, 1961. I think this is a very important lead-in to the Germans and why they came along. And what I've shown on the slide, under the 4 red bases, red underlined bases, are the 4 Canadian wings. This was an incredible effort by Canada on behalf of NATO and on behalf of Canada. On those 4 bases, we had 300 Sabres, about 400 or 500 pilots, all qualified, 6,000 Canadians on those 4 bases. I've also, because I'm going to talk in a few minutes about the German effort, I've marked the 4 German bases. But the red line down there is the important thing. That was the buffer between East and West. And why were the Germans reactivated? Why were they allowed to start up their armed forces again in about 1955? NATO realized that the only defense of that, the west side, was the Americans, the Canadians, the British, and a few from France wasn't very well counted on, Belgium and Holland and that sort of thing, Denmark in the north. But here was Germany, the economic miracle, the recovery of their country. And to see this, to be there and see this happening was incredible, how they were putting their energy and their effort into it. The NATO also realized that there was a thing called what they call the Fulda Gap, that if the Russians decided to turn west with their Warsaw Pact nations, that it was going to be very difficult to stop them. So we needed the Germans. The Germans were involved. They wanted to be involved. They were very keen on becoming a member of NATO. So they were allowed to start up their armed forces again under certain rules, I guess you could call that, on the basis of the unconditional surrender that had taken place. So they had the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force. I pointed out the 4 German bases with the green underneath them, which is where they established the German fighter wings, air defense fighter wings with their Sabre aircraft that they bought from Canada. Well, just to talk a bit about the there, I banged my foot. To talk about some of the 12 Canadian squadrons over there, and I think the thing that impressed me, and if you understand Latin, you'll see what's on the bottom of each of those crests, but I think some of them are quite, they send a message, if you like. Wandering by night, fangs of death, stalk and kill. This is 2 fighter wing. I can't read my Latin anymore. I studied it in high school for 5 years, but I don't remember it. Ready to leap. They have sounded the war trumpet, swift and stealthy. 3 fighter wing. We watch the waves. They'd been a maritime patrol squadron during the war. Striking shore. We conquer in the heights. And 4 wing where I was. With all our might, this arm shall do it. And the Snake Squadron, or the Worm Squadron as we used to call them, strike swift, strike sure. There was a lot of contest going on between the squadrons on who was doing best, who was having the best scores on the gunnery. It was a very competitive environment, very aggressive environment. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. We were out there to learn to kill Russians, and that was what the bottom line, that's what it was all about. And our whole focus and our whole training was on that kind of an environment. This is what Baden looked like when I was there. Beautiful, right on the edge of the Black Forest, the jewel in the Canadian military base. No matter where you looked in Canada or overseas, this was the jewel, right on the edge of the Black Forest. That's the Rhine River, right there. You can see, this is the squadron I was with, 422 Squadron. The aircraft were all dispersed. They weren't lined up in a row on the line. People had learned. Remember the Israeli-Egyptian war, where a couple of Israeli fighter planes caught the Egyptian Air Force lined up on the ramp at the base, and a couple of passes down there with guns blazing. They rode off the whole thing. Ours were dispersed in the woods, and of course, it was an effective form of defense. So we had 3 squadrons of 25 airplanes each. That's 75 airplanes, plus a few support airplanes as well.
Is that the strip in between?
That's the runway.
Yeah.
That's it, one runway, 8,000 feet long. This is just a couple other views of Baden on the left. And you see the trees on the base and how we were pretty well camouflaged. That vehicle towing the airplane at the top is a thing called a Unimog. We didn't have mules, we had Unimogs. It was a German vehicle, built by Mercedes-Benz, I think. And of course the ground crew there were covered. They were disguised, they could move around, everything was camouflaged. And the bottom right hand is one of the Canadian bases, Marville, just to let you have a look at how the dispersal went, how they had the airplanes distributed around the base. That's a Sabre in the bottom right-hand picture from 439 Squadron, and the motto is Fangs of Death, Saber-toothed tiger squadron. Everything was focused on that type of an orientation. The wing commander I had at Germany, the base commander, Group Captain R.W. Buck McNair, DSO, DFC, 3 DFCs, and the Air Force Cross and a whole bunch of other stuff, Brigadier, Légion d'honneur, but what a leader. He'd been in Malta and in Germany during the war. He'd been over there in England, then Germany, and he was renowned as an extremely capable fighter leader. Lead the guys into battle and organize them when they went in. Well, hadn't been over in Germany very long when we learned about the deal that had been done with the German Air Force for their day fighter. They had chosen the Canadian-built Mark 6 Sabre, built in Montreal by Canadair, with the Orenda 14 engine built in Toronto by Orenda Engines. Part of the deal was they were buying 225 of the advanced version of the Sabre, but we had a bunch of these Mark 5s sitting in Scotland at Scottish Aviation, and we were going to scrap them. So part of the deal was we gave them these to get started. And we painted them for them and had them all overhauled and refurbished. We also set up the operational training unit in Oldenberg in northern Germany to teach them how to teach people to fly the Sabre. So that the German pilots, and there was a bunch of Canadians went there, and I ended up there later, went there to teach them and get them people ready to go on squadrons and also people to become instructors on the Sabre. So I was assigned to go up to, in late 1957, to go up to Scottish Aviation at Renfrew and pick up, 4 of us went up there to pick up 4 of the German Sabre Mark V's and ferry them to Oldenburg. This is what the trip looked like. Renfrew to Oldenburg, which was Renfrew to Manston in southwest England. Southeast England was about a 40-minute flight in the Sabre. And then a bit of fuel, a bit of lunch, and over to Oldenburg. And it was interesting, we landed at Manston, taxi in with the 4 German Sabres, past a Spitfire on a pedestal and a Hurricane on a pedestal, and we pulled into line. Staff car drove up, and a group captain got out, an RAF group captain. He was the base commander. And what happens? 4 Canadians jump out of the cockpits of these things and attention, sharp salute to this guy, and he thought this was the riot. Anyway, they gave us the fuel and we went off to Oldenburg. Just the 2 bases I've marked there in blue were Canadian bases that were supply bases. North Luffenham and, North Luffenham and Langar were big supply bases for us because we had some freighter aircraft that flew back and forth supplying the 4 bases on the continent. So it was really quite an operation, a really top-notch operational operation. Well, when this was I just left, I spent 3.5 years at Baden with 422 Squadron, then I was assigned to the German Air Force as an advisor. This is the team at Oldenburg, the Canadian team at Oldenburg at that time. That's me standing there. And we were there, we had some ground crew, air traffic controllers, safety systems people, to help the Germans bring themselves up to speed, get into this modern era of jet flying. And that's one of the Sabres that had been given to them, one of the Mark V Sabres. This is just a picture of the Canadians. And there was that group of Canadians at Oldenburg at the operational training unit. Well, I found out shortly after I got there that myself and one other Canadian, Alex Leslie, were not going to stay at Oldenburg. We were going to be assigned to the 3rd German Sabre wing that had been formed, JG 73. That JG's Jagdgeschwader, fighter wing, 73. And the Germans had a policy of naming their flying units after famous air battle people. We became the Steinhoff wing. Johannes Steinhoff was one of the top German aces during the Second World War, had survived the war and came back into the German Air Force and eventually became their chief of air staff. But he was named Steinhoff. The 1st wing, 73 wing, was commanded by a guy named Erich Hartmann, who some of you may have heard of. He was the top scoring German ace, 368 aerial victories, but he was shot down and captured by the Russians and spent 10 years in a Russian prisoner of war camp after the war. And I met him a couple of times, very nice guy, but he was maybe 45 or so years old and he looked like he was about 80. The Russians had not treated him kindly, but there was some kind of a deal made and they got him out and he took over 71 wing. But they named all their wings, they still do it. They name them after, and they wear a band on the sleeve of their uniforms. That would be in the German script, it would say Steinhoff. And so they really honored the wing south of us where Hartmann was called the Richthofen wing, 71 wing, the 1st wing, 71 wing, Richthofen. Well, we moved from Oldenburg with the wing down to a place called Pferdsfeld, Flugplatz Pferdsfeld, Airport Pferdsfeld, which is down on the Nahe River. I don't know whether you know Germany that well. The Nahe is the next river south of the Mosel. So you can imagine what was grown in that area. Some of the best grapes for beautiful Rieslings. One of our German pilots, Joe Detzer, the Germans had national service. His father owned 2 hotels in a German city called Passau. Joe was learning the hotel business till he had to go in and do his national service. When we had a day off, Joe would take myself and the other Canadian, Alex Leslie, out on a Weinprobe. we'd visit the local wineries and taste it right out of the barrel. And if we saw one, if we tasted one we liked, the guy'd bottle it for us for a couple of bucks. So very interesting stuff, but it's just beautiful rolling country. Our Sabres, some were painted, some weren't, but eventually they were all painted in the NATO camouflage colors. And this is sitting on the, these are Mark VI Sabres sitting on the tarmac at Pferdsfeld. Whoops. One of our missions, besides teaching them jet fighter tactics, one-on-one or two versus two, was to get their senior guys up to speed on becoming section leads so they could fly with a two-ship and be in command of that two-ship or four-ship and take them into the combat mode. Learn how to, what the tactics were against the other airplanes, the types of airplanes that you might be up against, how to best use your mobility, how to use your airplane, how to use your weapon system. And by the time we had worked with them for about almost 2 years, we got them up to the point where they could sit NATO alert at the end of the runway. I must say, at the Canadian wings, we had 8 aircraft on 5-minute alert 24/7 at the end of the runway, and we could scramble in about 2 to 3 minutes when the phone rang. And it was a high level of concentration, a high level of readiness. And I must say, the Canadian wings and the Canadian operation was so good that I even heard Americans admit that the Canadians had the best air defense air force in Europe by far. The Americans too admit that, because they'd come and watch us on exercise and they couldn't believe what we could do with 25 Sabres, 25 pilots, and 100 ground crew, technicians. They were amazed at how we ran the operation. It was so well done and so well concentrated. It was leadership and training and concentration on training. Anyway, here's the first set of Germans parked on the NATO alert, parachute on the wing, helmet on the top of the canopy, and when the bell went, you could get airborne in about 3 or 4 minutes, very quickly. Very flexible airplane, very reliable airplane. The serviceability rate was extremely high. They eventually upgraded the 650 caliber machine guns and hung a Sidewinder under the wing. Sidewinder missile, which was a heat-seeking missile, just to enhance the capability. It slowed the airplane down a little bit, but it was another weapon in the arsenal to use. This is that picture you saw up ahead. This is my talking to Horst Fetzer, one of the German pilots. He's a lieutenant. I think the interesting thing is, if you look at that uniform, and you've seen any of the World War II German Air Force uniforms, there's a very high level of similarity. It was a blue-gray, and the shirt was gray. Look at the hat, not far off. He's one of the young German pilots. That's me in the special flying suits we wore, the anti-G suit, because a lot of our stuff in the combat maneuvering was high G maneuvers. You were pulling it all the time in an air fighting scenario, tight turns and vertical stuff. But I'll show you another picture of a few of them in uniform, and it looks very familiar if you're familiar with World War II looking. Just a few shots of the Canadair Mark VI flying around. The red and white drop tanks on that one. Few of the Germans got caught doing illegal low flying. By the way, the German military had no justice system. It was all done by the civilian courts because of the fallout from the Nazi and socialism before the war and during the war. So a few of them got, the German courts said, you got to paint your drop tanks different colors for different units. So if we see an airplane low flying, we can say to the person who reported you, what color were the drop tanks? At least they know what unit it came from. Just another picture of them in formation. There's the crest on the tail, 73 wing, and the German Iron Cross, the Ritterkreuz. One of the things we did, I mentioned that the Canadians went to Sardinia for 3 weeks every 6 months. A squadron went down there. I negotiated a deal with the Canadian headquarters at Metz that when one of the squadrons went, I could take 8 German Sabres and a bunch of pilots to that wing and use the resources and the facilities at the Canadian base, which were very advanced in terms of air traffic control systems, approach systems, and technicians, and the German technicians could face-to-face with the Canadians and really start to learn some stuff. This is a visit by one of the squadrons, number 2 Staffel or Squadron from 73 Wing with 434 Squadron of the Canadian Air Force. They happened to be in Sardinia at the time. And this is just a look at what the uniforms look like and the various things. About of the 45 German pilots on the wing, I would say only about 12 to 15 were officers. The rest were all non-commissioned. You'll see some there, corporals, sergeants, warrant officers, and that's me on the bottom right-hand corner. You notice I have the German wing. They awarded us the German wing to wear. And the fellow at the top, right there, is the major, number 2 squadron commander, George Furater. Super guy, flew 109s during the war. Great story at the bar one night. D-Day came along. They were flying 109s in northern Germany. They put a couple of bombs on the wings and said, "Go bomb the invasion fleet." And he said, the 4 of us got down there and we looked at each other, cockpit to cockpit, and one guy hit the radio and said, "We're not going in there. We'll never get home." Because he said the sky was black with Spitfires, Hurricanes, Mustangs, you name it, mosquitoes, thunderbolts. So we went over to the North Sea, dropped our bombs, went home, and never said a word to anybody. There's some very interesting stories like that. After we had left and come back to Canada, they decided to convert the wing to what they called JABO, which is ground attack, Yatka bomber. And they bought them the Fiat G91, but that turned out not to be a very good airplane. It didn't perform nearly as well. And they retired the Sabre and left them with the G91s, but they didn't last very long. It wasn't high performance. It wouldn't carry the payload they wanted. So very quickly, with the money, they converted them to the F-4 Phantom in both a reconnaissance role and a ground attack role. And they were at Pferdsfeld, and this is what the airplane looked like in the German markings. Great airplane, very high performance airplane, and a great payload it would carry. Well, I was in Germany in 1989. I was still serving at the time. It was in Canada, in my last job in the Air Force, but I had 2 small units that were stationed one in Baden, one in Lahr, and I had to go over and do staff visits every now and then. So I was over there one day, and I was about to come home that day. I was having breakfast in the officers' mess at Baden, and the waitresses, all the German ladies, were going berserk. So I got one of them over and I said, "What's going on?" And they said, "The wall came down last night." This was November 1989. And so I was there at the time. Got in the staff car with a German driver to take me up to Frankfurt to come back to Canada, and I thought he was going to kill me. We were listening to it on the Armed Forces Network on the car radio, and he was so excited I thought he was going to go off the Autobahn into the woods. But anyway, this is what it turned out to be. When the Russians left, the wall came down, the Russians left, the stories I heard afterwards from Germans, they took bathtubs, toilets, showers, wash basins, light fixtures, and left all their operational equipment behind. 73 Wing was moved to a former East German air base up at Laga, near Rostock, just south of the Baltic Sea. And they took over that air base. They said there were big problems initially because when the Russians wanted to change oil in a car, they didn't go into a place to do it. They just opened the tap right on wherever they were parked, and the ground was absolutely polluted. They had a big cleanup problem. But what went with that, when they moved to Laga, was the Russians left the MiG-29 fighters behind. And 73 Wing acquired those. This was a big boom, not only to the Germans, because it was a pretty good performing airplane, but the NATO people, like the Americans and the British and the Canadians, got a chance to fly them. And to talk to the German pilots, the East German pilots who've been flying, about what their air traffic control system, their air defense system was like. Much different than ours, where you give people in combat some initiative to make their decisions, to do things that are betterment for the mission. Over there, you didn't do a thing. If you're on the East, you didn't do a thing unless the guy on the ground told you to do it. Fly straight and level unless I tell you otherwise. They found that out, which is a big thing when you think of the strategy, planning your strategy behind something like that. So they added the MiG-29, But they kept the Phantom, so the wing, with 2 squadrons, 2 Staffels, one was F-4s, one was MiG-29s. The MiG-29s are all gone now. They went to some other country. '73 wing, the Germans got involved with the Eurofighter. 73 wing became the Eurofighter operational training unit. One squadron was an operational training unit, the other was an operational air defense unit. This was the Eurofighter, and that's what they have right now in the German Air Force. So it's a good high-performance airplane, and very sophisticated cockpit, as you can see, mega electronics. And I've talked to a couple of German pilots who've been flying them, and the thing works very well. It does the mission, it does what they want in Europe as part of NATO, part of the NATO scheme. They're very committed to that. Well, that's the Steinhoff wing. That's the badge I had on my flying suit, which I've kept somewhere at home. And the wing still exists. They're a major part of the NATO operation. The Germans were fully committed to this, and they still are. Just for a technical thing, just to show you what the Mark 6 Sabre on the right-hand column means compared to the American Sabre. We used to run into some of the American Sabres from time to time. The Dutch had them, the Danes had them, the Norwegians had them. We'd run into them on air combat exercise, and you could see, if you look down the right-hand column and compare it to the other two, you can see how much more powerful our 6 was, but also the performance was far superior. We could go higher, we could go faster, we could turn tighter. And the one shown in the middle, the Mark V, was the first iteration of the Canadian version. That's the 75 we gave the Germans. We had moved on to the Mark VI in our own Air Force. So, but even then, it was that much superior. The Canadian industry had done a fantastic job with the airplane. Not only just the bigger engine, but tweaking the control system so the airplane would turn better, lightening, making the airplane not weigh as much. That was good for the climb and the turn, and it was a great performer to fly. Airfighting was our game. I wanted to talk about this a little bit because that was our whole mission. Even if there was no canned exercise or something to do, what do? We started up the airplanes, briefed, started up the airplanes, climbed to 40,000 feet, and found any target we could, and had a run at them. And the skies were black. It was just terrific. That's some pictures of a couple of the Canadian Sabres that were painted, and these are some shots through the gun sight of some of the targets that we got. 105 on the left, a 104 in the center, and another Sabre on the right. Lots of close encounters. This is some pictures taken with us fighting it out with some British Hawker Hunters, which we were far superior to in terms of performance. Some of the British people wouldn't admit that, would they, Jeff?
No.
And we loved the work. The skies were covered with contrails most of the time. Guys going around looking for targets, chasing each other around. The expected enemy, this was a bonus we had. On the top left is a MiG-15. You may recall that during the Korean War, a North Korean took his airplane and flew to the south. The Americans immediately got the airplane over to Japan, brought over their top test pilots like Chuck Yeager, flew it, documented the performance. We had the performance, the documents. The right-hand picture at the top was the MiG-17. The Israelis got one from the Egyptians in one of the combats. They invited the Americans over. They flew it and documented it. We had the performance information. We knew what their flight envelope looked like, what was best. You suck the guy into your fight. You don't go into his fight. And that was what we practiced all the time. The bottom was the Badger bomber, but it was not of too much concern. It wasn't really anything we had to worry about, but they were around. I showed you some pictures of some hassles going on. Things got close. It was a very aggressive environment that I commented on before. We had some guys very proud they wouldn't give up. Sabre versus Sabre, 2 guys, same training, airplanes, the same performance, they wouldn't give up. And every now and then they'd touch each other. There were a few bailouts too when they got out of control, but these guys got these ones back with pieces missing. But it went on and it went on. This is what our operating world looked like, and this slide may be a little bit difficult to see. The red circles are the Canadian wings. The blue circles are American wings. These are French bases down here, but that's a fairly close map. And you could imagine the amount of air traffic around there all looking for a fight to practice. And so you had to keep your eyes peeled all the time from the time you lifted off and raised the undercarriage. Keep your eyes peeled because somebody's probably looking for you and is lurking. But we'd go and do the same thing at their bases. The business end, 650 calibers. That's a picture in the bottom right of it being fired in by our ground crew on what they call the gun butts. 90% hits at 1,000 feet in a 6-foot circle. Pretty accurate stuff, and we had a really good radar ranging gun sight in the airplane. So you know if you got into less than 1,000 feet on a guy, the typical shooting, you want to be in about 200 feet. If you had the pipper on him, radar controlled, tracking him, and you squirted off 200 rounds, 90% of them are going to hit him. Cause a lot of damage. We practiced all the time. This picture was loading up, 650s, lots of ammo. We practiced using them. I mentioned going to Sardinia for 3 weeks every 6 months, full practice. During that 3 weeks, you'd fly 50 missions. So there was lots of practice. That's the flag we shot at, and the bullets were all colored with wax at the front so they could mark to see who hit and who didn't. We were betting on who got the most hits in the flag, in the bull, the 6-foot bull in the middle. They had really worked. This is a picture of a MiG being taken down in Korea by the Americans. Trip South-Baden to Decci, I put this in for some of the guys, you know, an hour and a half. We had to go around Switzerland, that way the jog in it, and our weather alternate was North Africa, but if you're coming over top of Sardinia at 45,000 feet, to go to Sardinia is nothing. 90 miles is nothing, it's just, or 155 miles, it's gliding distance almost. But we never had to divert, we always got into Sardinia, into Decci. Big tri-service base, Germans, Italians, Canadians. And we were there, there was a Canadian squadron there all the time. This is just what the cockpit looked like. I threw this in for some of the pilots I was talking to on another presentation. The Sabre cockpit, very well designed. After the Second World War, the Americans got a bunch of their fighter pilots together and said, if we're going to move into more advanced aircraft, what should the cockpit look like? What's the best ergonomics so you can concentrate on your mission effectively, most effectively? So what we have is down the left-hand side of the cockpit, you have your engine controls and some of your electronics and hydraulics and things like that. Down the right side is the radios, and in the center console is your weapon system. And it worked. Very easy airplane to fly, very straightforward, very accommodating, and everything worked. The serviceability rate was extremely high. That's partially because we had magnificent ground crew. The technicians were really superb. That's just another shot of it from straight on. And great to fly. It had great controls, slats on the leading edge to improve the turning, speed brakes to slow you down quickly, and fully hydraulic ailerons and elevators, fully hydraulic. So you had lots of action to turn and to climb, to zoom. The Sabre retired from the Canadian Air Force about 1964. This is a picture drawn by a friend of mine. We have an association called the Sabre Pilots Association, and he's an artist on the West Coast now, and he painted that picture. But we still remember and dream. The guy in the mirror looks very young, doesn't he? I look in the mirror every morning when I shave and I still say I'm swept back, supersonic, and 21 years old. Not everybody believes that.
We do.
But I got involved again. I mentioned vintage wings. I learned from my very good friend Chris Hatfield at a dinner meeting in Ottawa that Mike Potter, who owns Vintage Wings, had bought the Sabre, former Canadian Air Force Sabre. And did I have any of my handling information, performance information? I said, yes, I did. So I sent it to Chris down in Houston, where he was with NASA at the time. And he photocopied it and sent it back. Then I got a call out of the blue from one of their pilots saying, we have to have a guy with your experience on board for the first flight. Would you come to Gatineau and be there when we do that? So I did, and I was recruited as a technical advisor on Hawk 1. I put this picture up because you see what the shape of the Sabre is. This was in 2009, the 100th anniversary of powered flight in Canada. And this was taken out in Comox, British Columbia. But it just looks so outstanding with that shape against these other airplanes. Really, I think it does anyway, and I'm not prejudiced at all. Great symbol of our heritage. What the Sabre did in the Canadian Air Force in the peak of the Cold War, in the 48, 50s, early 60s, was absolutely outstanding, absolutely magnificent. Just a great addition to our heritage. This is me checking the first guy out, Paul Kissman. All the guys who fly the Sabre Hawk 1 have to be ex-Air Force or serving in the Air Force, because the Air Force puts the ejection seat in and certifies it, puts the oxygen system in and certifies it. And they have to have an annual recurrent training done by the Air Force. So this is me checking out Paul Kissman. He's an ex-CF-18 pilot in the Canadian Air Force, commanded the squadron at Bagotville. That's the hat. I had to bring this with me. And I still remain engaged. These are all of the associations I belong to or I'm involved with across the board. Canadian Owners Pilot Association, 400 Squadron in Borden. I was their honorary colonel for 9 years. The Harvard Aircraft Vintage Wings, Sabre Pilots Association. There's a group in London, Jet Aircraft Museum, that bought 6 ex-Air Force T-33s that were parked at Mountain View for about 6 years, and were rotting away. Canadian Aviation Historical Society, and past national president of the Air Force Association of Canada. Now the Royal Canadian Air Force Association again. I did have a couple of incidents during my career. Engine problem in a Vampire on landing at Downsview, and I didn't quite make the runway. And the Sabre, I had a major hydraulic failure on takeoff, and I put it into the barrier off the end of the runway. 4:30 in the morning on a Sunday morning on one of those NATO alert scrambles. But I walked away. I put this slide in because I found it one day. We all remember when the year 2000 came, and everybody was panicking about Y2K. And I found this slide, and here was a Spitfire in Normandy after the invasion, Y2K. And my theme here is 442 Squadron knew what to do with Y2K, they just changed the engine. It was that simple, but that goes back a while. Oh, I put this in. Somebody was giving me a hard time about my 40 plus years of service in the Air Force, and I said, yeah, but I'm very proud of what I did for Queen and country. These have been awarded by Her Majesty the Queen on behalf of the people of Canada and by the people of Canada, so I wear these proudly when I get a chance. I've got lots of friends who in the same position. We're back in the Air Force, the RCAF, as you know, or probably know. We're back to calling, they're going through a process right now of starting to call people by the old ranks, Air Commodores, Wing Commanders, Squadron Leaders. Whether that's going to go through or not, some people object because they say we work so closely with the Americans, they don't know what these are. And I've said to those people, when we were in Germany, we were squadron leaders and flight lieutenants and flying officers. If the Americans knew what we were and who we were, that didn't bother them. They said, get on with the mission. That's what it's all about. Don't worry about that. But we aren't going back to the former rank insignia. We'll stay with what we've got now, apparently. Although they're looking at changing the buttons and changing the wings back to something similar. They're worried about French English, but we'll get around that. That's it. That's it. I don't know who gave me that picture, but I thought it's a good way to end off the presentation.
What's the aircraft?
A Mitchell. No, it's not a Mitchell. It's not a Mitchell. The Mitchell has a double tail. It's a Marauder, I think.
It's got the...
Marauder? Yeah, I think it's a Marauder. It came from the States, that picture, anyway.
If anybody has have any questions, Paul will be pleased to answer them, and just speak a little louder because our other mic isn't working. So there you go. Any questions, Sir Paul? Go ahead.
Yes.
The comment that when you took off in West Germany, and it was like every man for himself, that you were beating up or taking on mock air combat over West Germany and France and whatever, fascinates me. It was that sort of ad hoc or a free-for-all? I mean, that...
Well, a free-for-all is almost a good way to put it.
Air traffic controllers.
It depended on the weather for one thing. It depended, if it was a bright sunny day, you might be somewhat certain that somebody's going to be lurking around your airport, waiting to have at you after you take off. And the big thing was, right after takeoff, you're not really set up to launch into combat, so you're busy cleaning up the airplane, doing other things. So some of that occurred, but the weather in West Germany, a lot of the time, was not very good, so we'd climb up on top of cloud. Our typical mission in the Sabre was to climb right out immediately to 40,000 feet. And as soon as we were on top of cloud, we went into combat formation, which we call battle formation, spread out so guys can look around, look for targets. And you called every target. And so in many respects, it was a free-for-all. Find targets of opportunity, we used to call it. Anything that was a black speck on the horizon, go after it. In those days, there weren't the airliners at those altitudes. The airlines were all below 20,000 feet sort of thing. So if it was up there, you're pretty sure it was another fighter or another military aircraft. But it was like a free-for-all. That's a good way to put it. But there was also a lot of canned exercises. I was talking to my friend Jeff coming down. He was with the Royal Air Force for a while. And there was often big exercises, the British RAF trying to infiltrate the continent, and we'd be sent up to defend it on an exercise basis. Or we'd be tasked to go to England with 35 or 40 Sabres from different squadrons and see how they would defend against us. And that was a question of, how long would your fuel last? We only typically carried an hour and a half's fuel. So you were into the battle and home pretty quickly, or it was designated you would land somewhere else and get fuel. So, but it was exactly very much a free-for-all at a lot of the time if it wasn't a canned exercise.
During all of this, you're only minutes from the DDR and the eastern borders of the Warsaw Pact nations. So you had to keep this all also in mind too.
Yeah, there was down that border, there was a thing called the buffer zone, which stretched for about 15 nautical miles into our side, and we were supposed to stay that. Now, if I took off at Baden and turned onto a heading of about 045 degrees northeast, I would be in the buffer in about 10 minutes. So usually we headed west, or southwest over France, or up into the Low Countries, towards the Low Countries, Luxembourg, Belgium, the Netherlands.
But you had to familiarize yourself though.
Oh, you had to be very careful. Our maps had it clearly marked on it.
Yeah.
And we knew what the key pinpoints were. We had a couple of guys had wandered in there. Now, one of the things I didn't mention at Metz, which was the Canadian headquarters, there was a heavy radar, a heavy-duty radar, an air defense radar called Yellow Jack Control, and they were by far the best air defense radar in Europe. The Canadians were, and they were looking all the time. So if we were on alert at the end of the runway and somebody wandered into the buffer, we'd be scrambled like that to go and get them and escort them out. Hand signals, radio, whatever, if you could talk to them. But some guys ended up in the east and the Russians got all excited. There were times, I must say, that we were scrambled on a live intercept, not hot, live, which was an intermediary, because the Americans would send a high-performance fighter in right on the deck, right on the trees, into the east. And he would pull up and light up the eastern radar system, and then they'd watch how the Russians would react. This went on, and we'd be asked to go and escort him out, give him some top cover, so he didn't get intercepted unfairly, if I can use that word. without some protection. But this was going on all the time. You know, there's a lot of stuff going on in the Cold War that you didn't hear about over here. A lot of pushing and shoving and, you know, Kennedy versus Khrushchev and this sort of thing. And you heard that part of it. I was there during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We all went to a very high level of alert because of the interaction between the two sides. And when the Berlin Wall went up, that was a very high level of alert. We were issued sidearms to wear, just in case we had to use them. So but this was going on all the time. This was going on all the time. And it was fun. It was great. It was a purpose. You know, we understood what we were there for, and we trained accordingly. We knew, as I showed those pictures of the Russian airplanes, we knew what the enemy was likely to be. So, even sometimes the Russians wandered in by mistake too. Yes?
On that topic, the Russians often invade our northern airspace, or temperate, shall we say.
They try.
Did they do the same thing in Europe, even
Oh, yeah.
such
Yeah.
cramped quarters?
Oh yeah.
And
They
with
would
the
try to come up against the buffer to see what would happen. And they would try and light up our system, see how the response was. All those air bases, I mean, Americans had some very large air bases, so did we. We were between the Americans and the Canadians, that was the majority of the air defense. The British in the north were pretty well set up too. Different types of airplanes, but they were set up too. They monitored the aisles to watch what was going on. There's a lot of pushing and shoving and testing going on all the time. We had, in downtown Baden, there was a Russian consulate, not an embassy, a consulate. And from time to time, Russian cars would come out and park on the highway, just off the base, and to watch our airplanes coming and going. And they could write down the tail numbers if they could see them, to know which airplanes we had. We had to call the German police to come and move them. We didn't have the resources on our base. We had military police, but not with enough authority and strength to do that kind of things. But that was typical of the type of thing that was going on. I must say, I talked about a very aggressive environment. You saw the damaged airplanes from some of the very aggressive maneuvers, one against another. In the period the Sabre was over there, we killed 83 guys. Mid-air collisions, that type of thing. Bailed out, chute didn't open or something like that. And we have a very good monument at Trenton in the museum there for these guys with all their names on it.
Who's we? Us.
The Canadians, the RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force. And there were other things like that. But, there was one I remember when, a story, I wasn't there at the time, the Americans introduced the F-100 Super Sabre. And they had a big ceremony at Ramstein, which was 2nd Allied Tactical Air Force. No, 4th Allied Tactical Air Force, commanded by a German or American 3 or 4 star general. They were going to do a fly past, they had a big ceremony, and what happens, the Canadian Sabre comes in, gets in the slot behind these F-100s. There was some things said about that.
Well, I think there's a gentleman over there with
Yes,
a
sorry.
question.
I'm just wondering, besides the possible language barriers, was there any difference in training the German pilots? Were they very easy to
Pilots
train?
in English. They spoke excellent English. That's one of the things. When I first arrived in Germany, I realized very quickly how much English the Germans spoke. You go in the smallest town in the Black Forest for a nice dinner at a gas station, nice Vietnamese white wine, and you could always get looked after in English, even in the smallest little towns. I was talking to one of the young Germans sometime after that when I got quite curious about this. And he said, we took a decision in this country, Germany, after the wars, we were rebuilding our country, that we were going to become citizens of the world economy. To do that, we have to speak English. We have to speak English. And then young couples who had 4- and 5-year-old kids in kindergarten who spoke just as much English as they did German. So there was no problem. They were very proud of that. On the German wing, when we were instructing, everything was in English. English was the language of NATO. And they were very good at it, and they were very proud of it. And even when I went through my flying training on the course I was on in Claresholm, we had two Danes, 2 Netherlands, 2 Dutch pilots, and 2 French pilots, trainees. And the Danes and the Dutch could speak very good English. In fact, they were almost embarrassing because they knew the grammar better than we did. But the French were, that was another issue. That was another issue.
Paul, there were no two-place F-86 Sabres.
It was
What
one built.
experience did the German students have before you stuck them in a Sabre?
They had flown basic training, like the Harvard,
Oh, they did.
and they had flown the T-33. On the German wing, we had our complement of Sabres, plus we also had 4 T-33s that had been given them by the Americans for instrument flying training and communications flights. Unfortunately, they were American versions of the T-33s. Like the Sabre, they were highly underpowered compared to the Canadian version of the T-33. That was another job by Canadair. We took the American Sabre and put the Neen 10 engine in it. Big boost in power and performance. Cleaned up the cockpit. And Canadian's T-33 was a great airplane to fly. Not as fast as the Sabre or as maneuverable, but much improved over the American version. I flew them quite a bit too. Anything else? Yes,
If I do-
Sandy.
if I
Sandy,
do-
isn't it?
Yes, yes, thank you. If I do the math right, a lot of the young men in Germany at that time would have been ex-Hitler youth, right?
They would have been what?
Ex-Hitler youth. I mean, every little boy person was in the
Yeah.
Hitler youth.
I don't know that. A lot of the young German pilots, I showed you that picture of the corporals and that sitting around, they were 20-year-olds.
Yeah, so they would have been.
They could have been on that German wing. I don't know whether I mentioned this, on that German wing of the 45 or 50 German pilots, about 12 or 15 of them were World War II Luftwaffe,
Well, so that's.
who had flown combat operations. I told you about George Furiator and that
Yeah.
mission to drop.
But that's sort of part of the same question. So when the Germans were rebuilding their military and allowed to put up
Yeah.
the force, so I say allowed, I guess by NATO, did they have like some kind of screening program to make sure that they were putting guys in there that weren't going to be causing
I don't know
conflict
that.
with the Allies?
Well, before we went up with the Germans, we were interviewed by the Canadian commander at Metz, the Air Vice Marshal, Larry Ray. And we were told there were 3 or 4 things we were not to talk about. Treaty of Versailles in 1919, the rise of socialism in Germany, the rise of Nazism in Germany, the Hitler movement, and the death camps, Konzentrationslagers.
I mean, just a few years after the war, there's little else.
I know.
They talk about
And so we never talked about that with the Germans. We would talk about, at the bar, talk about the fights they'd been in, the air fights.
Right.
And they were quite good at talking about that. I could have told you a bunch of more stories from some of the guys,
Okay, this
the
is
World War II
important.
guys, but
This is-
they never touched it.
Did the Canadian, did our government refrain from sending any Jewish military personnel over there?
No, we had Jewish people.
So that was fine.
Yeah, it was fine. They were Canadians.
So there was never any issue?
And we had Jewish padres over there,
Yeah.
rabbis,
Yeah.
for the Jewish people. And
So
Catholic padres and Protestant padres. And
So there were no altercations over any of that?
no, there was none of that. No, we didn't have a lot of Jewish people that I can remember, but we did have a few. And they were, everything was fine. Nobody worried about that. One of the worst weekends I spent, we used to go down to Munich quite often, because from Baden to Munich was not a long drive, and down to Garmisch-Partenkirchen in the German Alps, because that was a big American rest and relaxation area for officers, and Canadians were invited as the friends. We were coming back from down there, 4 of us young Canadians, one of the guys' cars, coming back, and we got up to Munich and turned west, and there, as we drove along the Autobahn, was a sign that said Dachau, an exit off the Autobahn. And so we thought, well, let's go in there. This is interesting. We'd all read Schirer's book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, that had come out about that time. we went in and we found the concentration camp, the Dachau, the death camp. And you walked into the place, it was all cleaned up, of course, but the gallows were there, the shooting wall was there, the ovens were there, the barracks were there. And we got in the car after we sort of walked around and got back out on the Autobahn, and usually 4 young Canadian tigers, who were usually raising hell and telling jokes and singing in the car, were quiet as a mouse. And suddenly one of them said, "What a hell of a way to spoil a weekend." Because you suddenly saw that it was reality. And the Germans were not allowed to destroy those camps. But Bergen-Belsen's still there, Auschwitz is still there, and Dachau was there, and there were others around. There was quite a few of them around. And it was a very sad period. It was.
Just
Yeah.
to add to what you're saying, and what Sandy's asking, of all the countries that have, every war is always bad.
Yeah.
Always bad. There is no such thing as a good war.
No.
And any, real person who's been at war one way or the other. The Germans have admitted and put into all of their information for their school children.
Yeah.
And they have made apologies. And no other country really has ever done that.
No.
Including, pardon me, Britain. Really and truly. But Germany has. When push came to shove and they had to reformat, they did.
They did it, yeah.
And they have, and they still do.
Yeah. But it was a great country to be in. The people were so generous and good and helpful. And to watch them, what they had gone through in terms of, shortly after I was there, I met Germans who were professional people, accountants, business people. They had 2 jobs. One was at their office or their factory during the day, and in the evening, they went home and they went out in the streets and they pounded bricks, rebuilding their infrastructure. And they were that dedicated to the recovery of it all. And when you look at their road and rail system, it's just, and the road, particularly the Autobahns, there's no such thing with the rail system of a level crossing. It's either a bridge or a tunnel, because their trains run like that. When they say they're going to be here at 23 minutes after the hour, at 23 minutes after the hour, it rolls into the train station. And that's the way they operate. And they had a great economy. It was the economic miracle of Western Europe. Yes, the wine was fantastic too. And my white wines at home are white, are German.
I'm astounded that you went straight onto the harbor. In my time, we had to do at least 50 hours on a tiger moth before it was
Well, they
eaten.
were just on the verge of, at that time, of getting chipmunks. But they hadn't got that far yet. They had a few at Centralia, just in southwestern Ontario, trying them out to see how it worked. Because the rationale, and you would respect this, the rationale was you start the guys out on the Harvard, that's too tough a machine, and you're going to lose a lot of people, and it's more expensive to operate. Now today, in the Canadian Air Force today, they have a primary trainer run by a company, but out at Port Prairie, they go on the Grove, which is the equivalent of the chipmunk or the tiger moth. And then they go on the Harvard 2, the new version of the Harvard, which is a turbine airplane, a turboprop airplane. And then they make a decision whether they're going to be transport, helicopter, or jet. If they're going jet, they go on the Hawk. If they're going to be transport, they go on the King Air. If they're going to be helicopter, they go on the Jet Ranger version of the Kiowa, and then onto the bigger airplane. Yes?
You talk about some pretty Canadian aircraft, arguably a golden age of the RCAF in Europe. What do you then make of the bit of a mess we're in now with the F-35, and again, you also touched on the Eurofighter, possibly the comparative aircraft. What do you think of that?
Well, I think from what I've read, and I've talked to one of the test pilots in the States, I flew Sabres with his father, Pinky Flynn. This is Billy Flynn, who flew F-18s in the Canadian Air Force. Then he became test pilot. He worked in Germany flying the Eurofighter as a test pilot. Now he's in the States flying the F-35 as a test pilot. And I ran into him up in Gatineau a couple of weeks ago at an air show and had a long chat with him. He started explaining the technology in the F-35, and there's no comparison with anything else that's available. It's so far advanced, particularly the weapons system. You don't fly close formation anymore. You fly 4 airplanes 40 miles apart from each and talk to each other electronically without saying a word. You can say, there's a guy off your left wing, I'm going to shoot you and fire your missile for you. It's that advanced. And the F-35, I think, is, you buy the Super Hornet or something like that, and it's only going to last for 3 or 4 years until it's surpassed. I think the F-35, that's my personal view, the F-35. I ran into Peter MacKay here the other night at a meeting and introduced myself. He's now the Minister of Justice, but he was the Minister of National Defense, and he asked me what I thought about the F-35. And so I told him. He said, you're right. But I'm not prejudiced. Go fast, pull high G, and keep all the Huns out in front of you.
I'm so glad that we have people like you in the RCAF. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for joining us by podcast. We look forward to having you with us for future events, whether via internet or, we hope, in person. Either way, thanks for being with us, and goodbye for now.